Hi everyone. So in this presentation I will be talking about my viewpoint on the debate of animals in captivity, and by the title, "The Problem in Our Zoos Today," you can clearly see my standpoint on it. I actually just recorded this video on my laptop, but then the audio was not working, so this is my second attempt, so maybe I'll do this a bit better. So this is my introduction to the whole situation, or as I like to put it, a brief analysis. So I put my definition of captivity in case some people were not aware. Captivity is when an animal is captured by a human and prevented from escape. So this could be maybe domesticated, such as maybe being in a household like the Tiger King we're all so familiar with at this moment, or a zoo, aquarium, or a circus. Okay. Why does captivity occur? Captivity occurs not only for the benefit of the animal, so there's breeding programs or preservation programs that are put in place, which I'll later explain why are not a good thing still, but it's also for entertainment and commercial. So there are quite a lot of people who are gaining a lot of money from exploiting these animals, and like I said, I'm going to talk about this later. It's gonna drive me crazy. Absolutely crazy. This is not working. So now I want to talk about why it's wrong. And these are my subtopics I talked about in my essay here, and also the ones that I find the most important. Now, clearly captivity is a very wide array of different things, but I think the most misconceptions are coming from zoo ownership and aquariums, because I didn't mention things such as circuses or domesticated as such as having large animals that are supposed to be wild in people's homes, because I feel as if that is quite frowned upon. But zoos and aquariums are sort of found is maybe a little bit more accepted, I guess. Ignore abnormal behavior patterns, and in my little subtitle here I talked about Rob Laidlaw. So Robert Laidlaw is a man who travels between wild environments and captive environments and produces his unbiased observations about the difference in behaviours here. So one of my very large titles are elephants. So elephants are very, very large attractions of the zoo. So this is why their well-being is really at risk. So elephants have connections to family like we do as humans. They have aunts, they have uncles, cousins, all of that. So not only captivity being taken away from all of those, which causes inevitable mental harm, but the stimulation that comes with protecting and looking after family is impaired, which then causes the brain to not work as hard and result in a vegetative state. Also other lacks of stimulation, such as looking for food, protecting themselves from outside issues, shelter, finding places to breed. All of this that is not found in captivity lacks stimulation. So not only does this put animals in a dumbfounded and vegetative state, but it also harms the legs of the elephants. So from not exercising, a lot of them have very hard troubles walking and getting around. I just put some other species that found very prominent problems, but as you know, there are quite a large amount of animals that have these problems. So polar bears, you'd be surprised how many polar bears are actually found in captivity in the States. So since they're out of their normal environment, they really do not know how to act, and feeling out of state, being not really aggressive, but not doing a lot all day and things of that sort. Big cats sleep and are not aware of their surroundings. So if you think about the animals in the wild, especially big cats, they're very cunning, they're very devious and sly, efficient in finding their prey. So when they're put in captivity in very, very small spaces and not having that new stimulation, they're found sleeping all day, not doing much, not using their brains at all, which then decreases brain activity, also puts them in a vegetative state, but also is very, very abnormal to their normal behavior. Apes have a little bit of a different response to captivity, so they actually become increasingly more aggressive. So we've all known cases where apes have hurt a human and then it's resulted in their death, which is very unfair because captivity has caused them to act like that, but then it results in their peril. Also dumbfounded in the sense they've been found playing in their feces during captivity, which is not normal behavior in the wild at all. So mental and physical burdens, this is just a few strains of the body that captivity presents. So what's at risk here? There's been increasing studies that found when animals are isolated or put in small spaces, there has been a higher percentage of cancer cases, digestive disease, respiratory diseases, and accidents. Actually, if you got that sort of stimulation, this is also found in humans, the chance of all of this happening lessens, and you're only a third of a chance to get that now. There are also a lot of problems in pregnancies. So interaction has been proven to lessen complications at birth. So support from the other animals in your system actually cause pregnancies to go smoother, whether that be preventing miscarriage, preventing mothers being harmed during the pregnancy, death during childbirth, or complications with the baby. Childbirth. So childbirth is something that's quite interesting because there are behaviors that are learned in the wild when, observing other animals of that species that are very vital for survival. Something I found interesting is for antelopes. So antelopes actually fall and devour the amniotic sac to prevent the baby from suffocating. Now in captivity, they're completely reliant of man, which is okay because the humans would be aware of that, so the baby would not suffocate. But if it's a breeding program or something which are going to revive animals and send them back into the wild, now they have lost this trait. It's not doing anything for now preserving the species because a lot of the young are now going to suffocate and die, so then they're going to have to be forever found in captivity, which is quite dangerous if humans do not preserve these animals. So there was a study for rhesus monkeys by Robert B. Zajong, wrote a book about a series of experiments that occurred for animals. It was called Animal Social Psychology. So there were two test groups of feral and domesticated monkeys, and they were being compared. So feral monkeys were actually found to have better sexual behavior and better hygiene. So in the wild, that's inevitably going to help by reproduction, so surviving of the species, but also help in the sense that now they're more hygienic, they're less prone to maybe the diseases or fungus or any of that sort. But something I found interesting was that the domesticated monkeys were far more aggressive, which I had already explained. But then I read Jacqueline Barrow's book of Wonders of How Animals Learn. So the reason why animals have a sort of behavioral aggressive deficit in the wild is because they have to learn when to be aggressive and when to suppress. There's constant threats in the wild, but these animals are not, while they're suppressing their anger, they're now spending more time on maybe raising young or focusing on more important things, which then helps the future generation, because if the mothers are constantly aggressive, they are not raising their youngs in the sense that they're now set up for failure in their lifetimes. Inadequate spacing. So this section that I wrote kind of just talks about how much space the animal needs and how the zoos are not providing that. The zoos can decide how far they run, how high they jump, sort of thing, and the spacing is just not adequate. So the counterclaims to this is elephants, bison, antelopes, giraffes, and zebras, hoofed mammals, adapt readily to smaller spaces. Well, we already discussed how elephants really suffer in captivity because now of these small spaces, their legs are becoming quite useless and painful, which happens in these other animals. But unhoofed mammals actually make up a majority of the population. This is a very ignorant statement because it's completely being ignorant to the other animals that are inevitably suffering. So this is a rising new problems that I like to put about diets and lack of exercise. So because of these problems in the zoos, new things are arising that were never a problem before in the zoo, and let me explain why. So I want to talk about heart conditions here. So there have been findings that animals and generations that have been domesticated opposed to the wild ones actually have a decreasing size in heart because of the lack in stimulation. Also, autopsies on large birds have increasingly found heart conditions to be the cause of death, and there has been a lot of large birds such as ostriches dying because of heart causes. And this all can be credited to lack of exercise. So not only are animals in captivity now dying due to the lack of space and stimulation that's causing the exercise, but now if animals are continue to stay in captivity, mutations occur where now all of a sudden their heart's decreasing. So when they're put back in the wild, if that is the goal, and hopefully it is, then they're not going to be able to survive because all this new exercise will be a hard strain for their small heart in comparison to their bodies. So gastritis also occurs during captivity. Gastritis is the inflammation of the lining, protective lining in the stomach, and this is caused from diets that are not controlled, and this is more heavily focused on animals that are herbivores. So the zoos control the enclosures and the diets. Well, enclosures that have a lot of stones in, there are the wrong types of greens or too many being fed to the animals, then gastritis occurs, and this can cause nausea, cause vomiting, and stomach degeneration, which inevitably may cause death. And also liver problems can occur, and this is more common in carnivores, are sometimes given too much protein and meat in captivity. So when this happens, liver degeneration problems occur for these animals, which then causes them a lot of problems. And I know that it's safe to say that in the wild the diets are not controlled either, but you have to keep in mind there are specialists feeding these animals and knowing the consequences of what this does and then not living up to those standards. So I also want to talk about the killer whale dilemma, which I like to name Shamu's burden, because I think the sort of situation that occurred in SeaWorld was something that we're all familiar with, and it's very, very dangerous. And in this section, I'm mainly focused on orcas, but all animals in aquariums can be, I mean, fish not exactly, because their brains are not as functional, they're not as complex as something, but orcas are very, very complex animals. So I wanted to focus on these because I think it was one of the things that I think everyone's a bit more familiar with. So orcas form relationships like humans, more so than elephants. There's been cases where orcas, especially when they were at their most valuable and most prominent to being sort of want, that after a few tries, the mothers and the babies would go off from the males. So the males would go off to try and sacrifice themselves to protect the mother and their young, but obviously the helicopters and the boats would find the baby orcas and obviously take them captive. And the mothers and the males would surround the boat, wailing and trying to find ways to get their babies back, but they could not. Also, something that was very horrifying to find was that one too many of those baby orcas died from mishandling that could have been prevented. This is an orca nightmare because it's something that I learnt about SeaWorld and I just found atrocious for commercial gain. So when these baby orcas are taken to places such as SeaWorld, but there are multitudes across the globe, they're commonly trained beside experienced orcas who know the tricks. So if the trained orca flips, the baby orca is going to flip or try to. But if the baby orca fails to present this skill, then both the trained and the baby orca will not be fed. So at night times, these animals would be put in these confined spaces, very, very small, where there's barely any room to move. So when the babies were put in them, the ones who had caused the trained ones not to eat, they would all maliciously attack the babies, which would then not only cause wounds, but a lot of open scars, a lot of blood loss, and it was very, very dangerous. And you can see some of these scars, and it's just terrible to even think about. This is sort of just my wrap up in conclusion. So captivity, though it can be justified for breeding programs and maintaining a species, inevitably these creatures to forever live in captivity, because now the behaviors that are learned in captivity and being reliant on man will ensure that they will fail at the rest of their life. So as I listed here, the unnatural behaviors that can be dangerous in the wild. The diet's not being monitored correctly by trained professionals, and animals dying or having a lot of problems due to this is the own fault of the zoo. And if they're going to put these animals in controlled space, they should at least make a better effort to sort of, put a better eye on this. The wild would be disastrous, because not only are these learned behaviors bad, but now aggressive behaviors, especially by the monkeys, or sort of just things that can be taught, like the antelopes, are going to cause the death of their fetuses and their babies. So now these species aren't going to be able to keep going. And then mutations develop, such as the smaller heart, because when they have to experience the dangers of the wild, they're going to need to exercise and run away from danger or venture out to find new foods, and it's going to be too hard on their body and at no fault of their own. So I just hope by listening to this, one can actually take a step back and consider the dangers that captivity causes. And though what I say probably won't put a dent, in the debate, if it changes one person's mind, or sort of brings into light maybe the dangers in all of this, then I think this would entirely be worthwhile. And I really do hope that whoever's watching this takes this into consideration. And I hope you have a wonderful time. Goodbye.